There was a big hack a few years ago. I think it was Equifax, and they had to testify in front of Congress. And they threw one of their engineers under the bus, and they said, well, one of our engineers misconfigured an S3 bucket. And I found that to be so irresponsible, because I would argue that if someone in your organization made a mistake that has a material effect on your business, that's a process problem. That's not an individual problem.
Hello and welcome to the AI Master Group podcast, featuring the people who are building the future of AI in their work today. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. Today, I am very happy to have as a guest Dave Stern, who is a fractional CTO and DevOps engineer with over 25 years of experience in systems and software engineering. He's the president and senior solutions architect of Stern DevOps Group, which is a consultancy that's focused on early stage companies, providing technical leadership, infrastructure, and automation. He's also the author of a new book, Hackproof Your Startup, which is described on Amazon as the ultimate cybersecurity resource for startups with practical strategies for early stage engineering teams. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here.
So you've got a long history there. We know from your introduction that it's 25 years of experience. Can you summarize that in about 2 or 3 minutes?
I can. So I started back in the mid 90s doing software development way back when it was a much simpler time and much simpler skill set. Progressed through a couple of organizations doing that. Eventually got very interested in the systems and operations side of things. So in those days, we had system administrators and we had developers before DevOps was really a thing. Ended up managing a couple of teams. I worked at one point for a company that had its own data center and website development. So I got a lot of experience on the network side, as well as doing things like, debugging Cisco switches and JavaScript in the same day. And then 8 years ago, I started my consultancy started out as outsourced DevOps engineering. I had been working in AWS every day and enjoyed it very much. And also I operate as a fractional CTO. So I provide technical leadership to early stage companies, and those things go hand in hand. A lot of companies are focused startups are focused on pushing features and doing software development, and infrastructure and process and things like that aren't always at the forefront. So that's what I do now.
So you've written this new book. It's just come out. What motivated you to write that?
So I think that a lot of early stage companies either don't know how to or don't have the resources to focus on security. And I also think that there's this prevailing, or at least in my experience, what I've seen, there's this prevailing idea that it is either difficult or it is an afterthought, or it's something you worry about once you've deployed all your, software. And I have worked with many teams as an advisor, and I saw the same things over and over again, where, again, out of just simply not knowing or not having the time to, the pressures of an early stage startup don't always allow a technology team to focus on something like security. And so I wanted to collect a lot of the things that I've seen and produce something that I felt, and remains to be seen, but I felt that could be reasonably easy to walk through, get an idea of the bigger picture and the ways that early stage companies could look at security as an integral part of what they're doing, as opposed to an afterthought or an add-on. So yeah, that was the motivation, to empower these teams to understand that a little bit better, and secure their businesses. These people have put their life's work into it. Investors are putting in millions of dollars. It's a huge asset and it's a huge risk, and it doesn't take that much to get, it's like the 80-20 rule. 80% of what you need to do, it doesn't require a ton of work to get most of the way there.
Uh-huh. It's really well done, by the way. It's a really good book. I really enjoyed it. It flows really well. It's very logical, the flow. And I also like the way you kind of summarize the end of each chapter. Like if somebody wanted to cheat, they could just read the last page of each chapter and get through the whole thing in about 3 minutes.
Well, having been a developer myself, we all Google it. We go to Stack Overflow. We just want to look at the implementation details, get it working, and then figure out why later. So yes, if you need to go straight to the action items, please feel free.
But there's so much in there. And one of the things that I was fascinated by as you were really kicking off the book, you talked about the CodeSpaces hack. And it's been a while since then, but I remember that was a big deal. Can you refresh my memory a little bit about what happened there?
Sure, sure. So I think this is probably, at least in my experience, one of the more extreme and well-known stories of the dangers of getting hacked. So CodeSpaces was a company that I believe they provided some type. I don't know the exact details of what they did, but I know they provided some type of online repository for people to store their code. I think similar to like a GitHub. Um, but the key point in that is they're a SaaS business. Their business was their AWS account. They had databases. They had S3 buckets. They had EC2 instances running their code. And these days we do a lot more with containers, but still very valid. And there was a compromise of their account. I believe that someone gained credentials, and this is still unfortunately too common. Someone gained access to a developer's credentials that had administrative permissions, and they got into the AWS console. And when they did, they locked out everyone else, all the other login accounts, and then except I believe they left some capability for them to read an S3 bucket, and they put a ransom note in the S3 bucket and said, give us X amount of Bitcoin or we're going to start deleting your resources. And so the company scrambled. They tried to get back in. They couldn't do it. And the attackers started deleting databases and S3 buckets and irreplaceable data to the point where within, I believe, 48 or 72 hours, it was all gone. They had no backups, they had no recourse, and they had to shut the company down. And it's a sad story, unfortunately.
Oh my goodness. Those are the kinds of moments when you just say, if only, why didn't I focus? That's so obvious. How could that happen to me? I'm a smart person.
Yes, yes. And it's the kind of thing where you don't think about it, you just don't think of that as a catastrophic risk to a company. And one of the reasons, going back to your question before, that I wrote the book is there are still a lot of companies out there that are vulnerable to this sort of attack, and the solution is relatively straightforward.
Yeah. So, picking up on that, one of the things that I noticed in the book is that you position cybersecurity as an asset, which I found interesting, and as an asset that could be sort of incorporated as part of the early stage infrastructure rather than as an afterthought. And you touched on that already. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, the idea of cybersecurity as an asset.
Yeah, yeah. So cybersecurity is in the news everywhere these days. You hear about hacks on a regular basis. And one of the things that I say, paraphrasing myself, is your competition is probably already doing this. So if they're not, and you can sell your commitment to the security of your users' data or their data or what they're doing in your product, then you're either going to be ahead of your competitors who don't focus on that, or you're at least going to be competitive in a marketplace where other people are using that as a selling point. So I think these days you can't overlook that, particularly if you're in an industry that's either regulated or that does deal with personally identifiable information or personal health information. Like, you really can't slack on this type of thing. So it can be and I make some other points about like for example, selling it to investors, like this is a first class citizen of our development. We do think about security. So your investment is secure. If you're ever going to go for compliance, you're going to have to do this stuff anyways. And if you just follow best practices, you're most of the way there to begin with. Things like that, I think, are very strong selling points.
That sounds good. That makes a lot of sense. You also talk about what you refer to as a data insurance policy against ransomware attacks. So, what do you mean by that exactly, and how does that work?
Yeah, I love talking about this because this is like the meat. I hope people who watch or listen to this podcast buy my book, but if you don't, this is one of the main things I want you to get out of this. So, what a company like CodeSpaces could have done, and what existing companies can do, is you can do everything possible to secure your account, but if you assume that there is some minuscule chance, and maybe more than minuscule, that someone can get in to your account, then you have to assume they can do the same thing. They can encrypt all your data and blackmail you for the encryption key. They can just delete all your data just to be malicious, or again as a blackmail method. So what we always set up for our clients, and what we recommend, is and I'm going to speak in terms of an AWS or cloud account right now, but this could apply to on-prem, it could apply to bare metal. You need an isolated, separate environment that has separate credentials. So just getting into the technical weeds here for a moment, and I don't want to get too technical, but typically you either have a company with one AWS account, and all their environments, their development, their staging, their UAT, their production, whatever, are in that one account. Or, and what we see more of and what we build as a best practice, is a multi-account environment where each environment is its own account. But in order to access all of those, just for the ease of modern use, you'll typically have one login, an SSO solution, a single sign-on, either like Okta or AWS. And then from that login, you can switch accounts, you can switch roles. You want to set up something outside of that system, because if a single login credential is compromised or leaked, then an attacker has access to all those environments. So you want something separate. And then what you want to do, I say what one wants to do, is all of the critical data that can't be replaced, you want to do a one-way backup to the separate environment. So if you set up a separate backup account, you set up separate credentials, and then you set up backups that can only, all the permissions you give that backup system, they can just write to the new environment. They can't read from it. They can't get data from it. That other environment has no access into your existing environments.
You're listening to the AI Master Group podcast.
You set up backups that can only, all the permissions you give that backup system, they can just write to the new environment. They can't read from it. They can't get data from it. That other environment has no access into your existing environments. And so the idea is you have this backup account that's regularly getting snapshots of your database, where you're replicating your S3 buckets. And so if your account were compromised or unavailable for whatever reason, let's say there was a malicious attack and they deleted everything, you have your data. As long as you're using infrastructure as code like Terraform or CloudFormation, most people use Terraform these days, then you can rebuild all the infrastructure. And as a side note, I talk a lot about infrastructure as code, because being able to recreate your environments is not only good development practice, it's also good insurance. You recreate the environment, you can take the backup of that data, which the attackers can't access and probably don't even know exists, and you can be up and running again as quickly as a couple hours if you have it set up that way. And at most 24, 48 hours, it's not an existential risk to your business anymore.
Existential risk. That's really what it would be otherwise. I see why you're saying that is like the one takeaway from this podcast. Like, if nobody remembers anything else, because that one, do that, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Talking now specifically about AI, There's lots of startups that are feeling pressure to get out in front of the curve, and it's good, and to quickly innovate with new technologies, and especially with generative AI. From your perspective, is there any kind of methodology or framework that you recommend so that the technology leadership can enable this while at the same time protecting data?
Yeah, and this is, a lot of this is still very nascent, using generative AI in businesses, but the old time tested methodologies still work, in any business, we have, if your data isn't critical, if you don't have to worry about like GDPR or regulations where you have to protect user data, if you're just sending statistics you've generated, if you have a weather app and you're just sending weather statistics to have the generative AI do summaries for you or build models or whatever it is, you don't have to worry that much about that. If it gets stolen, it's not proprietary. Nobody's going to sue you. But most of us don't have that, right? We want to build recommendation engines with customer data. We want to do something a little bit more advanced. And so, as with anything, if you have data that's sensitive or critical, you either need to, well, traditionally you have to mask it and you have to make sure that it is sent securely. So you're using encrypted channels like HTTPS, you're storing it somewhere with encryption at rest, you are masking any personally identifiable things like email address or phone number. But also now we have the added risk or the added factor that, a lot of these generative AI systems are using our data to train their models. So you have to make the assumption that if you're going to build, for example, a recommendation system, and we've done this for clients, and send the data to ChatGPT, you can't just send raw user data. You have to somehow protect that. So masking, there's a couple of things I would say in a practical sense. One, masking the data. So turning, just using, for example, the user ID in your database and the descriptive information where you can't identify who that user is or anything about them, and you're not giving away anything proprietary to your company, like the secret sauce of your whatever it is that your SaaS business does, and sending that over, having the generative AI work on or the large language model work on that data that's already been masked, and then operating on that by matching your embeddings or whatever is one thing I would recommend. And then the second thing is, where possible, stay within the walled garden of the provider that you're using. So, as we speak, things like AWS Bedrock or SageMaker or things like that, they're internal tools. Bedrock in particular promises not to use your data to train a model. So if you can, staying proprietary where none of the data leaves your VPC, your private network, or your account is another way to make sure that you're not risking anything.
Mm-hmm. So now we've been focusing on enterprise and enterprise risk, but there's this interesting intersection between people and enterprise, especially when we talk about startups, because startups actually end up coming down to being people, not that many people, sometimes one person, sometimes two, etc. And so maybe to close this out, talking about the way people think and the risks that people incur, tell me what you think. If I had a laptop or a cell phone that got stolen somehow, what would I suddenly wish I had done before that had happened to me?
Another good question. And it speaks to broader topics that I talk about in my book. So if you don't mind if I digress on a bigger picture for a moment and come back to this, we are all human. We all make mistakes. That's just a fact. Like, you can't operate in any environment and, you can't train people enough to not make mistakes. I'm a senior engineer. I still make mistakes after this many years. You can find the most qualified people out there who've been doing this for many years, and we make typos. We do things without thinking. It happens. So, and I think it was Equifax. There was a big hack a few years ago. I think it was Equifax, and they had to testify in front of Congress, and they threw one of their engineers under the bus, and they said, well, one of our engineers misconfigured an S3 bucket, or I think that's what it was, something like that. And I found that to be so irresponsible because, and I say this in my book, I would argue that if someone in your organization made a mistake that has a material effect on your business, that's a process problem. That's not an individual problem. That means that you didn't set up the guardrails correctly in your business. You didn't follow things like principle of least privilege, or you didn't isolate your environments enough so that they just couldn't make that mistake. Occasionally things will happen, but we all and even if your people are perfect, they can still have their credentials compromised. So you still want to have things like isolation, where if their keys are stolen, the attacker can only do so much, and if they're like temporary keys, they can only do so much for so long and then they expire. So circling back to your question, I could be doing everything right with security and have my laptop stolen when I'm at a coffee shop, and all of that goes out the window. So what I would recommend people do, and I talk about this in the book as well, is first of all, make sure all your drives on all your computers and your internal and external drives are encrypted with a password. What people don't realize is even if my laptop is turned off and I don't have an encrypted drive, they can just pull the drive out, plug it back into another computer, and they get all the data. So you want to make sure that your physical hardware is secured. Similarly, you want to have your screens lock after a short period of time. Sometimes when I'm at home, I set them for a longer period, but if I travel or take my computer out, I have my screensaver and the lock go on after 5 or 10 minutes. So that way, again, if my computer is stolen, they've got about 5 minutes, they don't have any passwords, and then they can't do anything else. So that's another thing. And then use MFA with all your accounts, multi-factor auth. We all talk about that because, even if they can get into your systems, they won't be able to log in with just having the passwords. They would need your phone to get your authenticator codes or whatever it is. And then for an extreme level of paranoia, and I do this, I will admit, I don't use Face ID. I don't use the fingerprint unlock. I actually type a code in every time I unlock my phone. Now that's admittedly another level of extreme security, but the way I look at it, and this may apply to some of your listeners or your audience, is if I work with a lot of companies, I have the access to sensitive data for other companies. It's my responsibility to practice what I preach and do the things I say in my book. And this is going to sound extreme, but the example I always use is if I'm unconscious, they can still use my Face ID or my fingerprint to get into my phone or my accounts. But if it's a passcode only I know and I'm unconscious, they still can't get in. So now there's things like coercion, and we could go to an extreme on this, but I like to be extra careful in these situations.
Interesting. We could go down that rabbit hole all the way down to the middle of the earth. So very good. Well, this has been great, Dave. I learned so much, and I'm sure that the listeners did too. Can you tell me where to find your book and how people can get in touch with you?
Yeah. So the book is on Amazon. It's an Amazon Kindle book. So for digital download, you can just search Hackproof Your Startup. Hackproof is one word. I learned it doesn't come up very well if you do two words. My website is www.sterndevopsgroup.com. And those are the best ways to reach me.
Okay. Well, this was great, Dave. Thank you very much for spending the time with me, and more power to you. Just keep all those passwords safe and keep us all out of trouble.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the AI Master Group podcast. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. Until next time, stay curious and stay in front.